We are putting out millions of 5G antennae, either already or very shortly planned, in close proximity to almost every home, school, hospital, business, etc., making it essentially impossible to avoid exposures. It is outrageous to do this without doing serious biological safety testing. And so the plans which are going ahead in many countries around the world is to put out these antennae without doing one single biological safety test. That is an outrage. It should never be allowed. I've published 8 papers on how electromagnetic fields impact the cells of our bodies, and those papers have been very widely accepted in the scientific community. The first paper I published on this has now been cited 246 times, according to the Google Scholar database. So it's been very widely accepted in science. And I've given 58 invited professional talks on this topic in 14 countries around the world. So again, there's been very large scientific acceptance and support. I'd like to talk now about the safety guidelines that are supposed to protect us from these effects. So there's an organization that goes by the acronym ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. This was an organization that was set up by the industry to supposedly protect us from the EMFs. And they have suggested safety guidelines that are supposed to protect us. And much of the world has used either their safety guidelines or something that's very similar to them, supposedly to protect us. The tragedy here is they don't protect us at all. There are 8 highly repeated types of studies, each of which have tested the predictions of the ICNIRP safety guidelines. And each time they're tested, they fail and fail massively to predict biological effects and therefore to predict safety. And so we know there are many biological effects that occur at levels several orders of magnitude below the allowable levels in the safety guidelines. And so the ICNIRP safety guidelines simply don't work. At the core of the scientific method is the idea that when you have a theory and it's been tested and it's been shown to be false, you throw it out. So we have all of these data that clearly show the safety guidelines don't work. They are therefore false. Therefore, this ICNIRP safety guidelines need to be thrown out. And when the industry and the regulatory agencies fail to do that, they are grossly endangering our health. And we have this problem all over much of the world. Let me just talk in a little bit about what my kind of worst scientific nightmares are about 5G. Because I haven't really said much about, in fact, I haven't said anything about 5G to date. And so 3 of the tests of the safety guidelines involve the high activity of pulsation. And some of these are modulating pulses that modulate an underlying frequency, and some of these are pure pulses that just go up and come down. And in all cases, they make the EMFs much more active in producing biological effects. And 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed. It is designed to carry from 20 to 100 times as much information as 4G, which is already highly pulsed. It's the pulsations that carry the information. And so that means that we have every reason to expect that 5G is much more dangerous than anything we've ever seen before. And the findings that we're getting from Switzerland and from Stuttgart and unpublished findings from Southern California argue that that's really true. That is what we're seeing in humans. So what are then my worst scientific nightmares about this? And what I'd want to do is to share them with you. And each of these are things where other exposures that we have already before 5G was ever put in, we're already producing very high level effects in human populations. And we have every expectation that even those effects are sufficient to cause absolutely massive damage in humans, and 5G will be much, much worse. So what are they? Let's talk about them one at a time. One of them has to do with the reproductive effects. And there are reproductive effects in males and in females of multiple types. We get increased spontaneous abortion. We get lowered levels of each of the 3 sex hormones. We get a lowered libido. So everything that influences reproduction is being impacted. The worst effects seem to be on male reproduction. And we're seeing huge effects on male reproduction in human populations already. And so, for example, there was a meta-analysis published in 2017 by Levine et al., which showed that sperm counts in every single technologically advanced country on Earth dropped to below 50% of normal. Those sperm counts have already dropped much lower than that now in 2019. And there was a study published in Switzerland earlier this year, which showed that 62% of young males, who should be the most fertile, being young, were infertile. And that infertility was caused by the low sperm counts, by low sperm motility, and by other measures of sperm quality, which were very low. We know that EMFs produce each of those things from animal studies and from human studies. So, although I cannot tell you for certain that the EMFs are the sole cause of this, or even the main cause, we simply have no other idea that explains this incredibly widespread effect. So we are looking at a crash in reproduction to zero that has been seen in animals and is clearly occurring right before our eyes in humans. And so this is absolutely stunning. I mean, we can become effectively extinct based on the exposures we already have, completely apart from 5G. 5G could greatly speed this thing up. So we're looking at a crisis of the sort we've never seen before. And we can't do that. We have to respond. There's similar, but perhaps slightly slower effects with regard to the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. So we're already seeing huge effects that we know are caused by EMF exposures of the following sort. I can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, my memory doesn't work, and then there are also effects on tinnitus, there are effects on the sensory organs. And so they're all impacted and by extensive data from various kinds of EMFs. And complaints of these kinds of things are very widespread in human populations, and particularly in the so-called technologically advanced countries, because those are the countries, of course, that have the most EMF exposures. So I am highly fearful we're going to see a crash in our collective brain function. Everything is dependent on our collective brain function, and that 5G, because of its extraordinary high level of pulsations, will greatly speed this up. And it's already going at what used to be called warp speed, I guess we can say. So that's a great concern. So that's a second nightmare. Third one has to do with very early onset Alzheimer's dementias. We are seeing in many places around the world that the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease is dropping rapidly. So we're seeing very young people developing Alzheimer's. We're also seeing people who have what have been called digital dementias, young children, young teenagers and young people in their 20s, who are on their digital devices for many hours a day and on Wi-Fi for many hours a day. And those people are developing what are called digital dementias. We don't know how close or how far away those digital dementias are from Alzheimer's disease. There has simply been no study on it. But there is reason to think that Alzheimer's can be produced by EMF exposures. And let me just tell you what the most convincing evidence is on that. there are a whole series of animal models of Alzheimer's disease where animals develop effects that are very, very similar to what happens in human Alzheimer's sufferers. And so there were 2 studies published in which it was shown that the only thing you need to do to convert perfectly normal rats into very early onset Alzheimer's rats is to give them a series of EMF pulses. That is the only thing you need to do. You get close to 100% conversion to very early onset Alzheimer's. And this raises an absolutely gigantic question about 5G, which is, as I said before, extraordinarily highly pulsed. It's designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed. It could well be, we see in these animals that even 100 pulses within 1 second can produce very early onset Alzheimer's disease, that even a very, very short exposure to 5G might produce universal onset in humans. Now, I don't know that that's the case. I certainly hope it's not the case, but we are taking absolutely stunning risks that are completely and utterly unacceptable. 5G should not be put out without extensive biological safety testing. And what they are doing is putting it out without doing one single biological safety test of 5G radiation. This is an outrage. Let's talk about nightmare number 4. This has to do with the autism epidemic. The latest figures for autism in the US were that 1 birth in 36 was an autism child. Those were all children born in 2004. We don't have the foggiest idea what's going to happen to children born in 2019. Now, what connection, if any, do EMFs have to autism? We know that the EMFs work via activation of what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. That's my own work. And we know that activation of those channels from genetic studies causes autism. Okay, so we know that that can cause autism. And we know it has again, from genetic polymorphism studies, that it has an important role in producing autism in the general autism population. So there are mechanisms, and I don't think we have time to talk about them, by which this can produce autism, namely by disrupting the synapse formation in the developing brain during the perinatal period, during the period right before birth and after birth. And so we have very plausible mechanisms. We have some epidemiological studies that support this. And so we have very high-level concerns about it. Now, again, we need to do testing on this. There has not been one single epidemiological study done, for instance, in people living near cell phone towers. We've got already millions of cell phone towers out there completely apart from 5G. We're not even testing to look to see whether autism is more common in children who are born near near those cell phone towers. I mean, this is outrageous what's going on. And 5G, as I say, could make things vastly, vastly worse than what we're seeing already. Okay, so that's nightmare number 4. Let's talk about 2 more. I'm very concerned about the DNA effects. We know that the EMFs produce effects on our DNA that can produce mutations and also can produce cancer. And we haven't even talked about cancer as an issue here, but it is an important one. And I'm very concerned about mutations in what are called germline mutations. That is, when the sperm or the eggs are impacted, and we know that human sperm, the DNA in human sperm is impacted by EMFs that we're exposed to all the time. Namely Wi-Fi and cell phone radiation impacts the DNA, and so in human sperm, And so that can then produce large increases in mutations, and that can contaminate what's called the human gene pool. You know, all of our genes that we all have collectively that we can use to produce future generations. Well, you know, I've already said that there's question about whether we're going to have any future generations because of the reproduction. But then the question is, if we have any, how many of them will be impacted by severe mutations? That's a question that's an open one, and we don't really know how far along this is in human populations. So that's a major concern as well. Let's talk about number 6. This has to do with cardiac effects, and these have already been discussed here. EMFs have effects on human hearts, on animal hearts. They produce, and they're all effects that which involve the electrical control of the heart, the way in which the heartbeat is regulated in our normal physiology. And so we can get both tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, and for longer exposures, we can get bradycardia, slow heartbeat. In both cases, we have arrhythmias. Arrhythmias, particularly when they're associated with bradycardia, produce sudden cardiac death. We're having epidemics of young, apparently healthy athletes dying in the middle of an athletic competition. And we're not worrying about what's causing this. But we know, in fact, that a sudden cardiac death can be produced in animals by EMF exposures, and that you also get these other cardiac effects that I mentioned before. So we have reason to be highly concerned about that.